praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for listening to the GunGuyTV podcast and for all of your support and all the things you do to support GunGuyTV. I'm very, very grateful. I want to make sure that you know how grateful I am. By the way, this podcast is 1 hour long, although the first half hour is free and it can be heard on your favorite podcast player. The second half an hour is on Patreon only. So if you'd like to hear the entire podcast, please subscribe to Patreon. You will find the link in the description. If you can't find it there, you can go to our website at GunGuy.tv, and you'll find an entire page, I think, dedicated to Patreon. You can go help us out there. It does help us keep the podcast going. All right, this first half of the podcast, I want to address something the San Francisco city officials did in designating the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. And then in the second half of the podcast, I'm going to talk about something less political and hopefully very encouraging, and that is, why is hunting, which is something I love to do, why is hunting important for us to do, or for our kids to do, or for us to know at least something about in our American culture? We'll talk about that in the second half. But the first half, again, is dedicated to this article about what the San Francisco officials did in designating the National Rifle Association as a domestic terrorist group. And, of course, it's hypocritical as all get out. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the story, which I'll put a link to in the description of the podcast, says the San Francisco Board of Supervisors unanimously passed a resolution Tuesday declaring the National Rifle Association a domestic terrorist organization and urging other municipalities, states, and the federal government to do the same. The resolution calls out the NRA for inciting acts of violence and spreading, quote, misinformation and propaganda, unquote, and encourages the city to assess and limit contracts with vendors affiliated with the NRA. It stops short, though, of putting in place any enforcement mechanisms or new regulations, of course, because if they tried to do that, they'd get sued by NRA. They don't want to do that. The article goes on to say, and I quote, "The NRA conspires to limit gun violence research, restrict gun violence data sharing, and, most importantly, aggressively tries to block every piece of sensible gun violence prevention legislation proposed on any level, local, state, or federal," said this gal, Supervisor Catherine Stefani, who apparently is the one who sponsored the measure. So essentially what Catherine Stefani, however you say it, is saying is that because the NRA disagrees with her fundamentally and fights her every attempt to rob us of our constitutional rights, they are a terrorist organization, and by George, she's going to make sure that the city declares them as such. Okay, now look, I want to just take a few minutes here and talk about how incredibly silly that whole declaration is. So first of all, there are 5+ million American gun owners who are members of the National Rifle Association. I happen to be one of them. I'm a life member of the NRA. My wife is a life member of the NRA. Are we terrorists? If we are, I didn't know that. We're honest, law-abiding Americans. My wife is a speech and language pathologist. She works with little kids. She has for almost 30 years. We own a small business. We're small business owners. I have this little podcast. We're NRA members. Does that make us terrorists now because we happen to belong to the National Rifle Association? By the way, the NRA has over 125,000 instructors that are certified by the National Rifle Association as firearms instructors. I happen to be one of those. So does my wife. So does my son, by the way. And those are civilian instructors. I don't know if that counts the law enforcement certified instructors, the ones that teach and train police officers and security officers throughout the United States. I happen to be one of those. Are we terrorists because we're firearms instructors certified by the National Rifle Association? Which, by the way, in order to be a certified NRA member, or an instructor, you sort of have to be an NRA member. Oh, I should also mention that there are 8,000 some odd NRA coaches who are certified coaches to coach competitive shooting teams. Some of those compete at the Olympic level. I happen to be a certified shotgun coach with the National Rifle Association, and I rather enjoy coaching shotgun sports, trap and skeet and that kind of stuff. Does that make me a terrorist? Did you know that there are 2,200 training counselors, actually more than that, that are certified by the National Rifle Association. These are the instructors of instructors. These are the folks that teach and train NRA instructors so that they can teach students effectively on shooting disciplines. The NRA is absolutely outstanding at doing this. I was kind of curious about this, and I looked up the NRA website. In the About section, there's a little blurb there I thought was very interesting, and so I'll read it to you. It says, and this is a quote from their website, "While widely recognized today as a major political force and as America's foremost defender of Second Amendment rights, the NRA has, since its inception, been the premier firearms education organization in the world. But our successes would not be possible without the tireless efforts and countless hours of service our nearly 5 million members have given to champion Second Amendment rights and support NRA programs. As former Clinton spokesman George Stephanopoulos once said, quote, 'Let me make one small vote for the NRA. They're good citizens. They call their congressman, they write, they vote, they contribute, and they get what they want over time,' unquote." That doesn't sound like a terrorist group to me. I know it's not a terrorist group. I've been an NRA member forever and a day. It's ridiculous to think that the NRA is a terrorist organization. That's the nuttiest thing anybody's ever accused NRA of being. And by the way, so that you know, the NRA is not an organization in and of itself, all by itself, some lone thing. The NRA is made up of 5-some-odd million American gun owners who happen to be members of the NRA. I happen to, as I mentioned, to be one of them. Now, if you want to accuse someone of belonging to a terrorist group, you would assume that that group promotes violence, which the NRA obviously does not, and that the members of that group carry out the violence that group promotes. And yet, Rush Limbaugh, not too long ago, made this statement: not a single mass murder has been committed by an NRA member, unquote. Do you know, as far as I know, Mr. Limbaugh is right. Not a single mass murder has ever been committed by an NRA member. Wouldn't you think if they were a terrorist organization, they would be doing terrorist things? But they're not. However, this is interesting to note, NRA members have stopped mass shooters. Stephen Williford, a plumber and NRA certified instructor, stopped the mass shooter at the Sutherland Springs, Texas church. And he was instantly famous as having done it. Now, my understanding is that he still struggles emotionally with having to do what he did, with the violence he had to bring in order to stop the violence. Does that sound like a terrorist to you? I got to tell you, it doesn't sound like a terrorist to me. He sounds like an honest, law-abiding American citizen who saw a heinous act being committed by a lunatic and stepped up to try to save as many people as he could. And in the process, he had to shoot another human being. And that's not something that's sitting well with him. It shouldn't. I'm glad it's not. He would probably, as a Christian, think less of himself if it were, if it didn't bother him. Apparently it does, and I'm proud of him. He is a member of the NRA. He was an NRA certified instructor at one time. Certainly not a terrorist, and certainly not a member of a terrorist organization. You know, there are roughly estimated to be over 80 million gun owners in the United States. 80 million. Over 80 million. That's an amazing statement. That's a lot of gun owners. That's about 1/3 of the population. 80 million gun owners. Are they terrorists? What about them? Now, not all of them belong to the NRA. That's true. But many of them, a lot of them, identify themselves as NRA members even though they're not. And that's a fact. When surveyed, a lot of them will say, oh yeah, I'm an NRA member, because they support the Second Amendment. And in their minds, the number one defender of the Second Amendment is the National Rifle Association, so they associate themselves with it even though they haven't paid dues and become a member. Are they terrorists too? I don't think so. How about America's Hunters? By the way, I happen to be one of those. According to CNS News, this is the latest figure I could find, in 2011 there were 13.7 million hunters in the United States, and that number went down for a while and seems to be coming back up. And oddly enough, a lot of the folks that are getting involved in hunting now are women. A lot of the new gun owners in the United States are women. A lot of the new concealed carry permit holders in the United States, which without question are among the most law-abiding people in the country, and that has been proven over and over and over again, concealed carry permit holders. They're gun owners, obviously, many of them members of the National Rifle Association. Are they terrorists too? I don't think so. And, you don't think so. And the truth is, the city of San Francisco doesn't think so either. This is just an effort to try to bankrupt the NRA. They want to make sure that they're taking every step they can to see that bids for contracting or that companies that happen to do business in San Francisco or that might be affected by the city refuse to do business with the National Rifle Association. If they can possibly take the money away, that will hurt the National Rifle Association in a big way, and they know it. And that's why they're going to the trouble to do this. It's not about declaring them a terrorist organization. They know full well they're not. Instead, it's about the money. Follow the money. I'll give you some specific examples of what I'm talking about in just a minute. I want to point out the fact that with Walmart making the decision that they made recently to not sell guns anymore, not sell ammunition, and all those things that they're doing, that we might, as gun owners, want to start supporting retailers who actually support us and not the retailers who don't. So if we're going to buy ammunition, let's buy it from a retailer that supports the Second Amendment. If we're going to buy guns, let's buy it from a retailer that supports the Second Amendment. If we're going to buy hunting gear or anything like that that is outdoor sports related or has anything to do with firearms or the Second Amendment, let's do it with a company that supports the Second Amendment. I want you to know that Sportsman's Guide has been supporting GunGuyTV on Patreon for, I think, almost a year. Now, it's not a huge amount, but it's more than most people do. And I didn't ask them. They've never asked for anything. But they have a whole special deal now that they're doing that is really kind of cool and will save you some money. So I urge you to check out Sportsman's Guide. You'll find a link in the description, but you can also just search for them on DuckDuckGo or whatever you use. I don't use Google anymore. And look for Sportsman's Guide, and I urge you to support them because they support you. And that's important. Let's work with the people we know and like and trust. Sportsman's Guide is certainly among them.
This podcast needs your help. Send your entire wallet to The Gun Guy, 1313 Mockingbird Lane, Transylvania.
Now, when it comes to robbing people of the money in order to shut them down, look what YouTube, for example, does to gun channels or conservative channels or any channel that they disagree with. They demonize the videos and try to pay them as little as humanly possible because they hope to starve them out. They've found that canceling the channels doesn't work. It blows up in their face. They've found that demonizing the video and erasing the video doesn't work. It blows up in their face. But what can they do? They can say, well, our advertisers don't like to advertise on that content, so we're just not going to put ads there. But you can put the content up if you want. They figured out they can't make you go away one way, so they'll starve you to death and make you go away another. That's exactly what this attempt by the City Council of San Francisco is. Because look at it logically. What about Antifa, for that matter? Look, let's face it. Unless you live in a cave and you don't look at the news, you know that Antifa riots and commits violence on a regular basis. They call them protests, but I can't tell you how many Antifa riots I've seen and how much footage I've seen of them beating up people and abusing people and attacking cars and all kinds of things. Has the city of San Francisco declared Antifa a terrorist group? I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. And you got to ask why not. In fact, the San Francisco Chronicle published a pro-Antifa op-ed in September of 2017 entitled, "We Are All Antifa." That was the title. We're all Antifa. Seriously? That was in the San Francisco Chronicle. This is the same city that has now declared you, if you're an NRA member, or you if you're a gun owner, or you if you simply disagree with them, a terrorist. That's nuts. I don't see NRA members committing terrorist acts or causing violence or even calling for violence. But of course, the left never calls for violence. They never do that, right? Well, how about that time Eric Swalwell, Democrat from California, running for the presidency of the United States, threatened to go nuclear on gun owners, literally. How about Maxine Waters, Democrat from California, representative in the House of Representatives? She said this.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
To my knowledge, the city of San Francisco has not labeled either of them terrorists. Nor should they. I don't think they are terrorists. But they certainly have espoused violence. They certainly have called for violence. Both of them. Not something NRA does. Not something NRA members do that I'm aware of. Maybe there might be an individual NRA member that's done it, but I know an awful lot of NRA members, and I've been a member a long time. And certainly the National Rifle Association as an organization does not call for violence. The anti-freedom, anti-Second Amendment, anti-Constitution, American-hating left are constantly blaming others for the very things they regularly do. And I think sometimes we lose track of that. We lose sight of that. But here's some examples that I've already given you. I'm just going to word them a different way. NRA members are not rioting in the streets. They're not beating up people who disagree. Did you notice that? But Antifa does it all the time. NRA members are not threatening to use nuclear weapons against fellow Americans. But Eric Swalwell did it. He's a Democrat from California. NRA members are not calling for people to harass those with whom they disagree by chasing them out of public places and terrorizing them in their homes. But Democratic Congressional Representative Maxine Waters not only did it, but she does it. In a later speech, she said, and I quote, "I threaten Trump supporters all the time." She's proud of it. These folks are completely, totally, utterly hypocritical, and they're without shame in their own hypocrisy. They accuse you and I of doing things they themselves do and things they know we don't do. Why the general public falls for that scam, I don't know, but a lot of them do. It's important that you don't. They're not the only ones, by the way. I really get a kick out of the Hollywood types who do it. They do it all the time. It's not just the politicians that I mentioned. I mean, the Hollywood types do this stuff all the time. All you have to do is watch the news for a day. You're going to come up with a great example of how outlandish and totally hypocritical they can be, and the statements that they can make about gun owners and the Second Amendment that make no sense. One guy who's really that way is Sylvester Stallone. Now, I've not heard Mr. Stallone make such statements lately, but he's really made some crazy statements in the past. And when you look at what he does for a living and you hear what he says, you say, dude, you're a hypocrite. You're a hypocrite. I think it was back in 1998 or 99 or 2000 or something. He was in an interview. He was referring to criminal acts and talking about some personal experiences he's had of some sort or other and criminals using firearms. And this is what he said. It's ending, talking about the Second Amendment right to own firearms. It's ending. It's over. All bets are off. It's not 200 years ago. We don't need the Second Amendment anymore, and the rest of the world doesn't have it. Why should we? Until America, door to door, takes every handgun, this is what you're going to get. Unquote. That's Sylvester Stallone. Wait a minute. Isn't this the same guy who has made an entire multi-million-dollar career out of using violence and guns in movie after movie after movie after movie after movie? Am I missing something? Or isn't this the same dude? Now, he's just an example, but I mean, come on. We can come up with myriad examples from Hollywood of these people who make their money in promoting violence and on violent things on television and movies and then go out and decry gun violence when that's all they do for a living. Isn't this the same rich dude who is surrounded by security everywhere he goes? Oh, and you can absolutely bet that his security guards are what? Armed. But he doesn't want you to be. It doesn't matter that you might live in a bad neighborhood or that you don't, are not mega rich and you can't afford that kind of security. No. What's important to Sylvester Stallone is that you shouldn't have a gun because you might just be violent. This gets into that whole elitism of the elites only get to do these things. The Maxine Waters, the Eric Swalwells, the Governor Gavin Newsences, or Gavin Newsom, I know I call him Gavin Nuisance, the Sylvester Stallones. These are the folks that get to do those things. But you average citizen, me, I'm an average citizen. I'm not particularly special. Yeah, I got a podcast and a YouTube channel, but that doesn't make me special. I'm just some guy who's got, over time, I've built a little bit of a following, and I've got a platform to talk about the Second Amendment. But I'm not a celebrity. I'm just a regular average working stiff. That's all I am. And they figure I shouldn't have a gun. No, that's something they get to do because they are the elite. You and I don't get to do this. But then I look at Stallone and I have to ask, isn't this the same guy who lives behind a giant fence and a gate in a mansion protected by his personal security? And like I said, he's got security everywhere he goes. I mean, if you don't believe it, just watch video of him going someplace somewhere and you'll see the guards standing around him all the time. He doesn't have to worry about his personal safety. He pays people to worry about that. What's the difference between him and a politician who, when they're at work in the House of Representatives or the Senate, are surrounded by Capitol Police? Are you surrounded by police officers protecting you when you're at work? Are you surrounded by security everywhere you go? Are you, like Nancy Pelosi, one of the richest people in the United States Congress who can afford to live in a mansion and have personal security? Are you, for that matter, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. She's third in line to the presidency. Are you, like Nancy Pelosi, you have Secret Service protection? You don't have any of that. Or maybe you do. I don't know. But I know I don't, and I know the average American simply does not. We have to live every day in what is, for the most part, a wonderful country and a safe country. But that doesn't mean we're always safe. That's obvious when you look at what happens in the streets periodically. That's obvious when you see the mass shooters come along, or these terrible, crazy people that do these horrible things, and innocents die who might otherwise be able to protect themselves. But they can't, because elitists increasingly want to make sure that they can't. When you get into states like California, it's very difficult to get a concealed carry permit to take it with you in most parts of California. So you got to leave the gun at home. You can't take the gun with you. Now what? I had a guy contact me the other day who's a viewer and subscriber of the video channel on YouTube, asked me that very question. What do I do? I'm in California. I've tried to get a concealed carry permit, and they won't issue one to me because they don't issue. How do I defend myself? Like I said, Stallone is surrounded by people with guns who protect him. And he makes his money exploiting violence in motion pictures. He has become a multimillionaire by virtue of the number of people he has shot and killed on the movie screen. Has the city of San Francisco declared Sylvester Stallone a terrorist, or any of these Hollywood types of terrorists? No, I don't think so. They absolutely haven't. Now, in reality, the fact that the city of San Francisco did this really means nothing, but if it were to happen all over the country, in other cities or in states, that could be a problem. We'll talk about that in just a second. One way that you can support GunGuyTV is to join us on Patreon. That does a couple of things. One, it supports us so we can keep the videos coming, we can keep the podcast coming, and at the same time, it also provides you with some content you can't get anywhere else. I do an exclusive twice-a-month video podcast in which I do some training films and some other things and discuss topics that I don't discuss anyplace else. I do those on Patreon. They're only available on Patreon. There are pictures and behind-the-scenes photos and discussions that happen only on Patreon. And this podcast is an hour long. The first half an hour is syndicated and free. The other half an hour is only on Patreon. I do those things as my thanks to you for your support there. So I urge you, check it out and see if it's something you'd like to do. If it is, you can help out GunGuyTV and help us keep it alive by joining us on Patreon.
Shooting straight and always right on target. This is the GunGuyTV podcast.
As I mentioned, if this kind of approach of declaring the National Rifle Association or gun owners in general or other organizations, Gun Owners of America or whatever, declaring them terrorist groups for the purpose of frightening companies away from dealing with them or doing business with them, could be extended beyond the National Rifle Association. Certainly, it could hurt the National Rifle Association. Certainly, it could hurt gun owners in general. But at the same time, if it works with the National Rifle Association simply because these politicians and left-leaning folks disagree with them, wouldn't it work with anybody else they disagree with? What about the contractors who are helping build the wall? At some point, you declare ABC Contracting a terrorist group because you don't want them to build the wall, but they are building the wall, and the next thing you know, they can't get a contract from any government agency, and the next thing you know, other companies don't want to do business with them because they're afraid of being designated terrorist groups, and you can see right where this is going. California has already tried this, if memory serves me correctly, where the wall is concerned. Again, it's a strategy of trying to starve out the companies and organizations with whom left-leaning, anti-constitutional, anti-American politicians and groups disagree. If they disagree with you, you're a terrorist, you're a racist, you're a white supremacist, I don't care what color you are, you're a homophobe, whatever label they can throw at you, they're going to throw at you. And if it can possibly cause you to lose money in your business dealings or lose money in your organization, they're going to make that happen. That's why the NRA has been attacked by good grief. How many times have financial institutions been threatened if they don't stop processing credit card transactions for firearms retailers or firearms manufacturers, for that matter? Everybody does business on credit cards. I mean, that could cripple a business. It certainly would cripple ours. If we couldn't take credit cards in our online learning system, it would be very difficult for us to stay in business. So, yeah, could that cripple us and put us out of business? Sure, we're small. They could do that to me. If they could get the companies to stop dealing with me, we'd have trouble doing that. We'd have trouble making a living. That's what they're trying to do, and that's what they're trying to do with NRA. Right now, NRA is doing itself enough harm. It doesn't need any help from the city of San Francisco. But I think that's the other thing, is these folks are like sharks. They smell the blood in the water of all the issues going on with Wayne LaPierre and the NRA board and the NRA and all the troubles that they have. And they're seeking to do every bit of damage they can do in the hopes of destroying the National Rifle Association. So having discussed this a little bit, and before we move on to the next topic, I do want to make a plea, if you want to call it that. As I said, my wife and I are both NRA Life members. My son is an NRA member, and so on. Right now, I'm not sending money to the NRA because I'm not sure that I can trust that the money's going to go to what I intended it to go to, and that is fighting for the Second Amendment and defending the Second Amendment and constitutional rights. When I hear about Wayne LaPierre's $20,000 business suits and junkets here and there on private airplanes and some chick he put up supposedly in a condo somewhere and all this other stuff. Now, I don't know if he's guilty of any of that, but I do know he's been accused of it, and he has not addressed those accusations publicly, and he needs to. So I don't trust where the money's going, but the one thing I won't do is drop my membership. The one thing I won't do is say I'm not going to associate with the NRA anymore. I am a National Rifle Association Life member, and I'm proud to be an NRA member. The NRA and Wayne LaPierre are not synonymous. Wayne LaPierre is a guy who has come and he will go. The NRA has been around for a long, long time, and many people who have worked there have lived and died because the NRA as an organization has outlived them. And my hope is that it will outlive Wayne LaPierre and the board and the people that are there and me and my son and a bunch of other people. And for the next 200 or 300 years, however long it lasts, however long this country lasts, I hope the National Rifle Association is there strong and fighting to defend the Second Amendment to the Constitution and the firearms rights of law-abiding Americans. In order to do that, it has to have members. And so I'm not going to ditch the NRA. I urge you not to do so either, even though they have caused themselves a lot of trouble and they have caused a big mess internally. They're also being heavily attacked from the outside right now, and it's important that we as gun owners don't pile on. That's my opinion. Now, you may disagree with me, and I get it. We'll have to agree to disagree, and I respect your right to your opinion. But that is my opinion, and it's my show, so I'm going to voice it. Feel free to send me an email if you disagree. I'm happy to read your opinion as well. And we can agree to disagree and still move forward and fight the battle. Well, that is about it for this podcast, or at least this first half hour of it. If you are with me on Patreon, I want you to stick with me. We're going to launch into the next part of the podcast. We're going to talk about why hunting is a very important part of American society, American history, and American culture, not just in the past, but in the future and currently as well, and I'll explain why and why it's such a great thing to be part of in this next part of the podcast. So if you're on Patreon, I want you to stick with me. If you're listening to this on a public podcast player and you're just going to listen to the first half that's free, I thank you very much for all of your support. I hope you have a wonderful week, and wherever you go, whatever you do, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.